Okay, so this is my presentation on relational frame theory um, and also acceptance and commitment therapy. And it's just basically a brief overview of RFT and kind of the groundworks for what became acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. So, just to give a brief overview of RFT, relational frame theory, it explains the link between language and stimulus equivalence. And it does this by suggesting that they're the same phenomenon, arbitrarily applicable relational responding. So it's basically a functional contextual theory based on derived stimulus relations that views language and cognition to be based on relational frames. Um, now, a relational frame or framing stimuli relationally can be considered a generalized operant such as imitation or variability, or doing something original or new. So any type of action could really belong to these categories, regardless of its appearance or topography. And um, when we say that we're framing things in different types of relations, such as opposition or comparison or temporal, etc., uh, the term relational frames refers to the way a frame can really contain anything. So, with relational framing or relational frames, um, it's a behavior that humans learn early in life through operant conditioning, and it's characterized by three types of phenomena. The first one is that a relational frame must have the functions of mutual entailment. Now, mutual entailment, that's responding to stimuli that is bidirectional. So, with that, basically, if A is related to B, B is related to A. So there's functional reversibility here, and these types of relations can vary, such as if A is related to B, then B is related to A, or if A is smaller than B, then B is larger than A. So it can kind of vary depending on the frame you're looking at. And one more thing about mutual entailment that I think is pretty interesting is that the function of mutual entailment within a relational framing can actually result in language taking on aversive qualities associated with a normally aversive stimulus. So, for example, if we have Nicolas Cage here being stung by what looks to be a swarm of bees inside this head cage, Nicolas Cage will clearly have a history of being stung by bees, right? So the act of being stung enters the frame of coordination with the word sting. And mutual entailment then says that the word sting will take on aversive attributes of the actual stimulus of a bee sting for someone like Nicolas Cage here. So I thought that was pretty, uh, you know, interesting as far as what mutual entailment can do. Going back to relational frames, a relational frame must also have the functions of combinatorial entailment. And this basically means that responding between two or more stimuli results in a response to a third relationship. Um, so if we're going to train someone that A is equal to B, and then train them that B is equal to A, then they are going to be able to derive that B is equal to C. Um, and then coming from here, when you derive B being mutually related to C, what we have here is equivalence. And one quick thing about equivalence is that it's included in a frame labeled coordination. And the coordination frame is a relationship based on sameness and similarity. And there's other frames such as the ones listed here: opposition, distinction, comparison, etc. But I won't get into to detail about those in this presentation. And finally, relational frames, they must have transformation of stimulus functions. And with that, there's got to be a transformation of stimulus functions according to the established relation. So it's a result of how they're related to other stimuli. So where did acceptance and commitment therapy basically come from? In order to kind of find that out, we have to kind of back up a bit and look at two events here. One is the cognitive science revolution and ACT, and the other is cognitive therapy evolution and ACT. So starting off with the cognitive science revolution and ACT, this was basically a driving force behind the cognitive science revolution that involved behaviorism's inability to account for cognitive processes and their effects on human behavior. So Skinner's role in this, he basically rejected that thoughts could play a causal role in determining behavior. So from here, there are many different, cognitive scientists who rejected Skinner's perspective on this, and they said that human cognition was actually much more complex than what could be accounted for by direct operant conditioning alone. Moving on to cognitive therapy evolution and ACT, these were basically, it came about from a reaction against psychodynamic therapy. And the cognitive therapies of Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck have oftentimes been described as reactions against this type of psychodynamic therapy. So Albert Ellis, he created what was called rational therapy, and Aaron Beck created what was considered to be cognitive therapy. Now, with cognitive therapy and cognitive therapy evolution, there was also two scientists, Bandura and Meichenbaum, who created treatments to capitalize on the role that a person's internal dialogue plays in terms of influencing behavior. So then we have the creation of ACT. Hayes and his fellow colleagues began attempting to come up with cognitive techniques from a conventional behavioral perspective. So in 1982, there was a publication by Zettel and Hayes that looked at cognitive restructuring techniques that were advocated by Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck. And one technique they looked at was called cognitive distancing. With cognitive distancing, this is basically when a client is taught to notice that they're problematic thoughts that automatically come into their head, and their core beliefs and whatnot. They're supposed to view them as hypotheses rather than actual established facts. So Hayes and his colleagues continued to expand on this technique and basically thought it was possible to help change a person's belief that thoughts are only thoughts and not absolute truths. So this was known as comprehensive distancing and eventually took on explicit values and selfish concept aspects, and then came to be known as ACT. So the development of RFT and ACT and RFT was actually somewhat of a reaction to both cognitive revolution and evolution and conventional behavioral therapy, going back to when Hayes and his colleagues realized that Skinner's 69 definition of verbal rules as contingency specifying stimuli was actually pretty it wasn't enough. So some basic views of ACT itself. Why would someone want to use ACT? Well, there's it can be viewed as a treatment for problematic behavior that's controlled by rules. And it's said that there's two ways clients can have problems. One is that their behavior is dominated by dysfunctional rules, and another is that they're failing to respond to more useful rules. And I won't get into the therapeutic approach of ACT, but just know that there's many different avenues and paths one can take with ACT in a therapeutic way. And one of the major cores or principles of ACT is what's called cognitive fusion. And this actually occurs as a result of mutual entailment. So going back to our friend Nicolas Cage here, if he's describing himself as a failure, then the word failure to him actually becomes fused with his own sense of identity. And this actually transfers stimulus functions of the word failure to himself. So that's kind of how cognitive fusion works. And in order to help with that, there's something called cognitive diffusion, which is basically language deliteralization. And that's where you're taught to kind of see thoughts as what they are and not what they say they are. So that's just, kind of to guide, you on the path of the different types of techniques, language deliteralization techniques that, there are to help people with this. This is kind of a starting point, but again, I won't get into that with this presentation. I'm going to kind of leave it at that. And with that being said, that is the end of my presentation here with just the references, and then I will post my discussion questions on the website. So thank you all for listening and watching.